Hello and welcome to the Lincoln Journey. We're on part 10 of the Conspirators, the story of the Lincoln assassination. In episode 9 we did some skipping around. Lincoln is dead, Secretary Seward and others of his household are shockingly cut up. Booth has gotten away, but despite the brightly moonlit night, his mare has come a cropper and fallen on him, breaking his ankle. We left him looking for medical attention. We moved forward a couple of days and got Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin, Mary Surratt, and Lewis Powell arrested on Monday, April 17th. Now we will turn back the clock to the early hours of Saturday, the 15th of April, and try to get Booth the doctoring he needs. Around 4 a.m., Booth and Harold arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd near Bryantown, Maryland, which is about 25 miles south of Washington. Booth once again gave the explanation that his horse had fallen on him and also said that in the fall he had hurt his back on a rock. Mudd later claimed that he didn't recognize or even know Booth, but he did know Booth, and years later he privately told a friend that he recognized him that night. He cut Booth's boot off of his swollen ankle and set the break with makeshift splints. His gardener made Booth a pair of crutches. Mudd allowed the travelers to get some sleep at his house. That afternoon, he went into Bryantown to make some purchases and soon heard about Lincoln's assassination and the involvement of Booth. There was now little doubting who his pre-dawn visitors were. He headed home, and when he was nearly there, he saw the pair leaving by a side road. He caught them up and complained bitterly that Booth had deceived him, and he threatened to turn the fugitives in. But he settled for clearing them off his property. Big mistake. On a side note, in the wider world, with Booth identified but still at large, false sightings of him were reported as far away as Chicago and Canada. The Philadelphia Inquirer said that it was no longer safe to be good-looking. Dark-haired, handsome men with mustaches were being arrested and jailed all over because of their superficial resemblance to Booth. Ironically, Booth shaved off his signature mustache at Dr. Mudd's house. Booth and Herndon left Saturday afternoon intent on reaching the shore of the Potomac estuary, but search parties were already swarming the area, chasing rumors of assassin sightings. The two conspirators needed help from the Southern Maryland network of rebel sympathizers, and they had to proceed very carefully to avoid both capture and searing pain in Booth's leg. The athletic actor was not his quick and nimble self after his accident. Would the countryside have been more willing to take risks for Booth if he and his accomplices were on the run with a trussed-up Lincoln rather than fleeing from the scene of his murder? Hard to say. As it was, the horror that was felt by people after this heinous act led to a frenzy to bring the killer to justice that made very plain the likely consequences to be visited on those who assisted in his escape. While there was, of course, pressure to not be an informer, there was also a strong inclination to avoid those consequences. Still, some were willing to risk them. Late Saturday night, the fugitives made it to the home of Samuel Cox, a prosperous farmer well known for his Southern sympathies. Cox let the pair into his house and probably fed them, but wouldn't let them stay. "I thought Cox was a man of Southern feeling," grumbled Booth as he was helped back into his saddle near dawn. A cold front was moving into the area with strong winds and plummeting temperatures. Whether solicitous of Booth and Harold's welfare or worried how they might importune and imperil his neighbors, Cox decided to go out looking for them. He and his overseer found them in a ditch. He had his overseer guide them to a stand of woods where they were to wait for a signal from someone who would help them on their way. The someone was Thomas Jones, a seasoned and particularly embittered agent of the Confederate Secret Service. His hatred was fueled by the fact that the Federals had imprisoned him and confiscated his large house, whereupon his wife had died. Jones, eager to help and quickly enchanted by the still charming Booth, found the pair and counseled them to lie low until the heat died down. Having also found Booth's rented mare wandering around, you may remember she didn't like being tied up, he told them their horses would likely give them away. So the mare and the mild and unoffending Charlie would have to go. Davy Harold and Cox's overseer took them to a nearby swamp, led them into deep water, and shot them. Davy and Booth stayed in the thicket for 5 days and 4 nights. Jones brought them food and, at Booth's urgent request, newspapers. What he read did not improve his waning spirits. He was shocked by the carnage that Powell had wrought in the Seward house. While wishing that Secretary Seward himself had died, he regretted the injuries suffered by the others and was relieved that Seward's daughter Fanny had not been wounded in the fray. But mostly, he was deeply disturbed to find his act universally decried. The latter-day Brutus, having killed the tyrant, was supposed to be hailed as a deliverer. Instead, even anti-Lincoln newspapers reacted with horror. The usually critical Daily Intelligencer reflected the immediate deification of the martyred president. Quote, "None has ever lived in all the tide of time who evinced more purity and who was more trusted by a great nation in the issues of its life and death. He could not have, among those worthy of consideration, a single enemy." End quote. What? John Wilkes Booth not worthy of consideration? Booth thought the newspapers were purposely hiding his pure intent by not publishing the letter he had given to John Matthews to post. He didn't know that Matthews had read the letter after the assassination and, terrified that he would be implicated, burned it. However, trained actor that he was, Matthews first memorized its contents. Finally, on Thursday, April 20, Jones felt conditions were advantageous enough to chance a river crossing. He had seen a cavalry detachment sent off on a wild goose chase in the other direction, so he hurried to the pine thicket, alerted Booth and Harold, and led them 2 miles to his now much smaller home on the river, where a boat was tied up in a nearby creek. He went inside to get them some food. "Oh, can't I go in and get some of your hot coffee?" pleaded Booth. But the disciplined operative Jones knew that he would be seen by servants, and he couldn't take the chance. He took Booth's compass and showed him how to steer to safety on the Virginia side of the river. Since all the good places to cross the Potomac were heavily patrolled by the U.S. Navy, the spot chosen by Jones was not a good place. The current was swift and dangerous. They set out with Harold rowing. Patrol boats were in the vicinity, and viewing the compass by candlelight would mark them out from a mile away. A number of complications ensued, the sequel being that when they landed, they were several miles upstream, on the Maryland, not the Virginia side. Apparently, a strong wind worked against the current, but I'm still impressed by the hardiness of little Davy Harold, who is usually dismissed as a virtual nonentity. He rowed all night, and even if they still hadn't crossed the river, he had avoided gunboats and other perils. You try that sometime. Harold was familiar with the area of their landing, and they made their way to the home of trusted resident John Hughes. Hughes did not greet them cheerfully and would only offer the safety of a slave shack on the riverbank. Still, it was the first roof that John Wilkes and Davy had over their heads in nearly a week. At this point, I wish to pause and reflect on how some of my characterizations may be misunderstood, and to make more analogies to motion pictures. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, often used his cinematic mastery to get us to side, or at least to sympathize with, criminals and unsavory types. After the shocking murder of Marion Crane in Psycho, our heart rates quicken as we worry that Norman Bates won't clean all the evidence of the crime. In Saboteur, Norman Lloyd's character is a cold-blooded murderer, but we hold our breath as the stitching on his jacket sleeve comes loose when he's hanging from the top of the Statue of Liberty. If my description of the travails of our conspirators includes cliffhangers or makes you think that I am sympathizing with them, I can assure you that I am not. I may acknowledge Davy Harold's accomplishment on the Potomac when he rode all night, but I don't think it makes him an admirable person. And as John Wilkes Booth plays out his increasingly tragic role, maintaining his pride and bearing, my description may seem to imply a degree of heroism. But no matter how nobly he presents himself, or how justified he is in his own mind in committing his crime, he remains a cold-hearted outlaw who had ample opportunity to see the error in his logic. If you peel the onion back far enough, the motives that led him to his infamy were his white supremacist beliefs and his defense of and belief in chattel slavery. So he was working from an extremely flawed premise. So don't anyone compare me to my favorite director, Alfred Hitchcock. On the other hand, it is easy to hold George Atzerodt in contempt because it seemed like he chickened out of murdering Vice President Andrew Johnson. We should recognize that, like some of the other conspirators, Atzerodt was fully on board with kidnapping the president, but he balked at murder, as he should have. He was still a slovenly fellow who drank too much and liked to hint broadly about his secret involvement in momentous affairs. But if we hanged everyone who fit that description, life would be less colorful. But Atzerodt was doomed nonetheless. His association with Booth had not gone unnoticed, and he was a wanted man. He got as far as his uncle's house in Germantown, Maryland, where he tarried carelessly for 4 days, oblivious, it seems, to the net tightening around him. At 4 a.m. on Thursday, April 20th, the date that Booth and Harold made their first attempt to cross the Potomac, Atzerodt was arrested in the bed he shared with 2 other men at his uncle's house. Once in custody, he quickly confessed, and soon he was on a train back to Washington. When his custody was passed from his military escort to the D.C. police, a marshal snapped new handcuffs on him, pinching his wrist. "Don't pinch me," Atzerodt protested. The unsympathetic marshal shot back, "I will pinch your neck before you are a week older." The frenzied assassination investigation arrested hundreds of potential suspects. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had taken charge of the investigation immediately after the attack in Ford's Theater, working from a parlor in the house where Lincoln lay dying. When Booth was not captured by the day after the shooting, Stanton put out a call across the country for detectives working at any level of government to come to Washington. Their efforts were often more competitive than cooperative, especially after Stanton announced rewards for the capture of Booth, Harold, and John Surratt. $50,000 for Booth, $25,000 each for the other 2. Unwilling to lose track of anyone who may have participated in or was witness to any part of the conspiracy, the detectives, the police, and the military patrols crisscrossing the Washington region and beyond picked up many tangential individuals who were later released, but only after unpleasant days and weeks in prison. The old Capitol Prison, which had housed political prisoners, Confederate spies, and sundry others during the war, gained new notoriety by offering its hospitality to Mary Surratt, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Ford's Theater owner John T. Ford, and John Wilkes Booth's brother Junius and his brother-in-law, John Sleeper Clark, among many others. Located where the Supreme Court building now stands, it originally served as the U.S. Capitol, while the permanent Capitol was rebuilt after being burned by the British in 1812, thus the name Old Capitol Prison, or also called the Old Brick Capitol. Special accommodations awaited those whom the authorities deemed most dangerous. Just days after Abraham and Mary Lincoln visited the USS Montauk at the Navy Yard, the Montauk and another Monitor-class ship moored in the East Potomac, the USS Saugus, became makeshift maximum security prisons, both for their ironclad construction and for their isolation in the stream. Atzerodt was confined on the Montauk along with his cousin, Hartman Richter. Hartman was one of the unfortunates who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. but he might have fared better had he not lied to the soldiers who knocked on his door at 4 a.m. on April 20th. They asked for Atzerodt, and Hartman told them, "Oh yeah, he was here, but he went on to Frederick about 30 miles away." When the soldiers said they were going to search the house anyway, Hartman suddenly remembered that his cousin was upstairs in bed. The authorities didn't arrest the two other men in Atzerodt's bed, or Hartman's father, or his wife. But Hartman seemed to know that Cousin George was involved in something hinky, so he got the full conspirator treatment. Meanwhile, the nation was still reeling from the death of the president. On Easter Sunday, parallels between Jesus Christ and Lincoln resounded in pulpits throughout the land, usually noting that they both died on Good Friday and were martyred for the sins of others. Wednesday was a national day of mourning. Lincoln's funeral was held that day at the White House, and his body was then borne in an elaborate march to the Capitol to lie in state. It was on this day that Jefferson Davis, still on the run in Charlotte, North Carolina, first heard about the assassination. On Friday, as Booth and Harold found themselves landing back in Maryland instead of Virginia, and as Dr. Mudd was arrested at his home, Lincoln's funeral train left Washington for a circuitous trip back to Springfield, Illinois. The route was roughly the reverse of Lincoln's train ride to Washington before his first inaugural. When he had left Springfield on February 11, 1861, he spoke briefly and poignantly to a large crowd of friends seeing him off from the station, saying at one point, "I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." If his words sounded overly dramatic or inclined to hyperbole then, they certainly did not now. Next time we will introduce another alleged conspirator, and we will develop the case against Mary Surratt, the Surratt who didn't get away. See you then.